I'm David Bouch, Seed Manager for Hutchinson's. We're at Grayingham in North Lincolnshire looking at the autumn plots. We're here to look at the wheats in a virtual plot tour for autumn 2020. We're looking at a projected wheat hectarage for the autumn of being significantly greater than in previous seasons and certainly bigger than last year's. Current estimates are that the crop could be approaching 2 million hectares this autumn, maybe as big as 2.2 million. So significant crop going in the ground on the back of a season that we've never seen before and hopefully we don't see again. If we start with the Group 1s, they haven't changed really from last year. You've got three key varieties. Crusoe is still the preferred miller's variety and will likelihood command the greater premiums. It's a little bit prone to brown rust and its yield doesn't quite match that of Zite and Skyfall, but it'll certainly be in demand. Skyfall still takes number one in terms of Group 1 milling wheat hectares. It's only just tumbled behind Gleam in terms of total hectares, so a very widely grown variety. The only milling wheat Group 1 with blossom midge resistance. Both Skyfall and Zite have encountered a little bit more yellow rust this year, and I think in terms of choosing the right one for you will be down to 1, your consumer end home, 2, which variety appeals to you the best in terms of agronomics. If blossomage is important, then you would go for Skyfall. If variable drilling date is important, again, Skyfall will tick that box as you can drill as late as the end of February with it. If we move on to the Group 2s, I think this is quite a clear choice now. It was a market where people were growing them specifically as feed varieties because their yield matched some of those of the Group 4s. I think now the feed yield is superior and therefore you need to be growing these for a different reason. The premiums will be difficult to attract, but I think Extace stands out here for a whole host of reasons. It's the best Group 2. It has the highest untreated yield of any variety currently available to you on the HDB lists. Its yield is as good as anything in the Group 2 sector, and it's very difficult to argue against growing that particular variety. And I still think you'd probably grow it as a feed. Unless people are prepared to name premiums on some of these varieties, I don't see any choice other than growing Extace. I think Extace is multifunctional because it's quite good in light land situations as well, tall straw, and one of the highest in that particular section. So I think Extace will be the one that people will look to this year. It came into the market new last year. People have had a chance to evaluate it on farm commercially, and the reports are very, very good. Septoria resistance at 8.1 is pretty much as good as you'll get. So I think from that point of view, that's where I would be looking to favour it. People may well look at Detroit as being a Group 2. There are potential end homes for that going forward, but very, very little seed availability for this autumn, given the fact that a lot of seed crops didn't go in the ground last year. So I think in summary, Siskin and Lily are becoming varieties from the past. If you get on well with them, then there's no need to change, but I suspect at this point in time it's difficult to argue against much other than Extace. Group 3s. Group 3s, we've seen an advancement in the Group 3 sector. We've had KWS Firefly come in, which has the highest yield of all the Group 3s. It has the best agronomics in terms of disease of all the Group 3s. It has the best Septoria, which the Group 3s have historically struggled with. So if you take Barrel here on my right, Barrel has had a very poor Septoria, but has managed to get away with that because we haven't had significantly poor Septoria years. Outside of that, it's good for yellow rust, it's stiff strawed, it has blossom midge, it's very high yielding in the north and will still sit well in the north. But I think if we look at what's happening, we've got illicit, but I think from my point of view, we're now looking at Firefly being the way forward in that soft sector. Firefly looks good in these trials, and I think from that point of view, people should be looking at as their option. Its bushel weight's fractionally low at 75.8, but I think from that point of view, in most seasons, at least 9 out of 10, bushel weight will not be an issue. And if you've concerns about bushel weight with varieties, just do not put them onto lighter land, put them onto better soils where bushel weight risk is less likely to occur. We're now into Group 4s, which we still probably talk about as softs and hards, but that differential between yield between the hard 4s, which always used to have the greater yield, and the soft 4s has now disappeared. So I think we refer to the group 4s as they are, and if you've got an end market that prefers hard, then we can specifically highlight those varieties. If you've got an end market that prefers soft, the same can be said. But I think if you're looking at pure yield in the group 4s, Skyscraper is the one that people need to look at. It has positive distilling if distilling markets are available to you. Septoria is a little bit on the low side, but in terms of out and out yield, it is the one to beat. It has blossom ridge resistance. It's a variety that I think people can really put in the ground and be confident with. It's a good variety for light land because although it's a little bit taller, it isn't likely to lodge. The twin 7s are a good twin 7, but taller varieties tend to do well on light soils. Next to it, we've got Sundance, which has been around for a number of years now. Sundance is a clean variety, very good for Septoria, also very good for yellow rust. Sundance's biggest issue, I guess, is that it probably has a slightly lower bushel weight than people would like. But again, much like we talked about on the Firefly, if you're concerned about bushel weights, just put them onto better soils and that will negate some of that problem in a good year. But it's certainly superseded by Skyscraper in terms of pure yield, because Skyscraper I think is currently the best variety for people to grow if you want to fill the barn. In the softs, there's a new variety in this sector called Saki, and Saki is a variety that I think people need to consider. It's a clean variety, stiff strawed, looks to have a suitable slot for early drilling, and I think one thing that people will be looking at this year on the back of the last autumn is drilling earlier. Saki you could drill if you wanted to as early as the first week of September. That will still be very early for a lot of people, but it does mean that if you're going to urge towards earlier drilling, Saki will do a job for people there and is a new variety to consider. If we move into the hard group 4s, Grayingham has become a grower's favourite, been remarkably consistent, good Septoria resistance. Also very suitable again for earlier drilling, so not a first week of September, but certainly you'd be comfortable in the second week of September slot. I think of the other group 4s, we can look at Gleam as being still a good performer. Troubled a little bit by yellow rust this year, as is anything that's had a Hereford in part of its parentage, but Gleam is suitable for early drilling. It's also suitable for late drilling. It has blossom ridge resistance, and it's now the most widely grown variety within the UK. Gravity has had a better year this year. It had a couple of poorer years, but this year it's looked good in plots. It certainly fills the barn, it has blossom ridge resistance, and it has the opportunity to perhaps not shrink as much this year as people perceived it would do, given the fact it's responded to a tricky season and performed quite well to date. Due to the unseasonably dry spring, I've now had to take a little bit of cover under these trees whilst another deluge follows us around the plots. But all in the cause of communication, we'll continue to talk about hard group 4s. So we've covered the first 3 in Gleam, Gravity and Grayingham. I think another one that needs mentioning is Inciter, which is the highest yielding hard group 4 on the list now from Syngenta. Looks to have very good grain quality, good bold bushel weight, a little bit weaker strawed, so it will need a better PGR program. But I think if you follow those lines, you've got the potential for a very good wheat in that particular slot. Outside of that, you need to try and keep it simple. People are talking about Theodore. Theodore has got good untreated yield, but a bushel weight of 73.5 is something I'd be concerned about. You could argue 9 years out of 10 that won't be an issue, but I think if you're looking at that, it doesn't out yield Ixtace. It isn't as high untreated yield as Ixtace, so I would suggest that Ixtace would be a better option rather than Theodore in my personal preference. There are a large number of candidates in the plots this year. I think the best thing to do will be to evaluate them once we've seen some trials data. They look quite similar. You've got to say at the moment, given out and out yield, there will be a challenge for most of them, if all of them, to get onto the recommended list. They have to out yield the control varieties by 2%. Some of them are just about doing that, but I mean only just. And in a year like this could be a really challenging year to evaluate candidates and give you the right information. So I think at this point in time, given the circumstances, it's better to play safe. Of all the ones that I can see at the moment, Astronomer looks to perhaps be one of the best. Another group 3, good septoria, good yield, but it probably doesn't out yield Firefly, and therefore I say we revisit those later in the season, September time, once we've seen some of the data, and update you on those accordingly and give you something that's perhaps more creditable. The final candidate we can say a little bit on now is Wolverine from RGT. It's the first variety to have BYDV resistance. It is available in such small quantities this year that my advice is that if you go looking to grow it, already think about putting your name down for next year. It is actually okay in terms of yield. It sits at about 102%. That won't get on with direct yield, but with its trait of BYDV resistance, it will go on. There's enough probably to do, I don't know, 8,500 hectares this year out of a 2 million hectare crop. That is a very, very small percentage, but it will give it the chance to be evaluated against other varieties commercially that don't have BYDV resistance. I think it will be a very good illustration for it, because with people reverting to earlier drilling, the likelihood is that BYDV is going to be more prevalent, and therefore it couldn't probably have a better year. The other breeders haven't got anything quite like this yet. Syngenta are suggesting maybe 22, 23, but there is not a lot in the pipeline. So RAGT have got a good position on this. They've 4 more coming through in 2 years' time, 2 potential milling wheats, 2 potential feed wheats, and 1 of those will have blossom midge. So Wolverine will be talked about. It is worthwhile considering, but in terms of seed availability, it's very, very difficult to get hold of.